Welcome to Lesson 6. In the past lessons, we talked about characteristics and mechanisms for secondary succession. And now we'll go into looking at how people have modeled secondary succession to try to better understand how a plant community will progress or develop through time. Let's first look at the classic rangeland successional model. It was originally developed on the Great Plains to predict vegetation response to cattle grazing. It was initially developed by Clemens and his students as a linear single pathway successional response in vegetation to the grazing, although many other ecologists also contributed to this development. Succession was thought to be linear, such as in this graph, going from early through mid-late several stages and eventually end up at the climax or at PNC along that successional gradient. Succession could be moved forward by above average rainfall, or it could be moved backwards or called retrogression by drought or higher grazing pressure. This classic rangeland model also viewed the result of secondary succession as having a single stable composition termed a monoclimax. This view of succession has largely disappeared, but it resulted in a large amount of terminology that we are still using today. Some of the Clemensian terms still used today include disclimax, is when successional development is held in check by humans or animals, for example, by excessive grazing by livestock or wildlife. Subclimax is when the development is suspended for a relatively long time prior to reaching the climax or PNC. The term post-climax means that when the vegetation is more developed than one would expect for the regional climax. For example, a shrub community that develops on a north-facing slope of a grassland. And pre-climax then is when the vegetation is less developed than one would expect for the regional climate. Another successional model is the polyclimax successional model. This model assumes that for each regional climate, there is a potential for more than a single stable composition. The expected stable composition caused by the regional climate was known as the climatic climax. But under this polyclimax successional model, stable compositions could also be caused by environmental factors, such as topography, soils, or frequent disturbances, or herbivory, and that these compositions were more or less permanent on the landscape unless a disturbance occurred. The stable composition caused by frequent disturbance could change with changing the frequency or severity of the disturbance, so the disturbance regime. This model can be illustrated with a ball and a cup example, where the cup represents the system and the ball represents the current vegetation. The effect of gravity represents the effect of secondary succession, and gravity, of course, will try to pull that ball down to the bottom of the cup, where we have the stable composition, or PNC. And as the ball moves up the side of the cup, we move away from PNC. So to earlier successional stages. So this graph is illustrating a vegetation that's been displaced by disturbance, fire or some other disturbance, and we can see that in the dotted circle, kind of up on the cup there, and then it's being pulled down towards that stable state via secondary succession. This graph, on the other hand, is illustrating a stable composition that has occurred as a result of a frequent disturbance that is away from PNC, or the bottom of the cup. In this case, it's a zootic climax. That's where succession is held in check by herbivory. And if the frequency or severity of this herbivory changes, the stable composition will change and a new equilibrium condition will develop under this model. Another model of secondary succession is that of initial floristics. Early research implied that disturbance set back succession to a very early seral state that was dominated by pioneer species that we've talked about before. This was understandable because much of the earliest succession research was focused on primary succession and on newly formed landscapes, or secondary succession on abandoned ag fields. However, in most instances following disturbance, we know that we do not begin from a totally bare site. Rather, the post-disturbance community is composed of remnants of the previous community. So here we're looking at the Wyoming big sagebrush, bottlebrush squirreltail site, and following the disturbance, we can see that we still have grasses, such as basin wild rye, bottlebrush squirreltail, and in this case also the introduced cheatgrass and tumble mustard. Frank Egler was one of the first to recognize that most of the time the immediate post-disturbance plant community was a mixture of disturbance survivors and new species. In this Wyoming big sagebrush community that burned, we have basin wild rye as a survivor, and squirreltail is another survivor that was in the plant community prior to the fire and survived. And then we also have new species, cheatgrass and tumble mustard, that came in and established from seed. So according to the initial floristics idea, the post-disturbance community will be composed of survivors that survived the disturbance, and also addition to the community from either the seed bank, so soils in the seed bank, or immigrants from adjacent vegetation. The disturbance survivors will be dependent upon, number one, the composition of the pre-disturbance plant community. So what was in the community prior to the fire? Secondly, the severity of that disturbance. The greater the severity of a disturbance, the fewer individuals are likely to survive. It also depends on what kind of disturbance, because some species are more sensitive to certain types of disturbance compared to others. And number three then is the type of disturbance, since some species are more susceptible to one disturbance type compared to another. And a fourth factor is the post-disturbance environmental conditions. Stressful post-disturbance environmental conditions may contribute to greater mortality of survivors, as well as establishment of seedlings. In this example, we can look at how disturbance type and disturbance severity can affect the initial post-disturbance community composition. So we start off here in the left with a mature sagebrush steppe with the grass understory. If we have a disturbance being the low severity fire, we may end up with a grass-dominated herbland. Remember that sagebrush is very sensitive to fire, high mortality of sagebrush. If we have a high severity fire, we might have a higher grass mortality, and we may also, and of course the sagebrush, high sagebrush mortality, and we'll end up with more of a forb grass-dominated herbland. If we have moderate severity grazing, we may end up with a mature sagebrush and early seral perennial grasses in the understory. While if we have high severity grazing and lots of the grass is removed and may incur mortality even, we may end up with a mature sagebrush with an annual grass understory. This graph intends to illustrate the concept of initial floristics that we just talked about compared to the relay floristics that we talked about earlier in the class. Notice how in the initial floristics idea, the early successional species tend to remain in the plant community just as at a lower abundance. And from personal observation, I really believe that the initial floristics is more realistic than the relay floristics, where the early successional species are completely or mostly eliminated from the plant community. And this leads us into yet another model, the multi-pathway model for plant succession. In this model, the initial plant community or the post-disturbance plant community may be able to take different pathways but result in the same climax or PNC, for example, depending on the post-disturbance precipitation and post-disturbance environmental conditions. So in this graphic is illustrating different pathways depending on the average precipitation the year after disturbance. Factors that might impact which pathway succession is going to take is that of persistence of species in the community, conditions for establishment of species, and the critical life history events that might occur. Methods of persistence for species in a community include dispersed seeds, and examples of dispersed seed species are fireweed or false dandelion, for example. Then we have the soil store seed species. One good example there is Ceanothus that you see on the picture. They can store seed in the soil for hundreds of years. We then have the canopy store seeds, and good examples of that are lodgepole pine or eucalyptus. And for vegetative recovery species, we have many. We have aspen, most grasses, and snowberry. Conditions for establishment also impacts with which pathways succession might take. We have species that are able to establish at any time. Those are the tolerant species. We have species that may be able to establish only after a disturbance, intolerant species. And species that may be able to establish only after the environment has been modified by the presence of vegetation. In the past two slides, we talked about methods of persistence and conditions for establishment as factors that impact multi-pathway succession. So a third factor then is critical life history events, stages that are based on longevity of plant and seed, age to sexual maturity, and replacement or replenishment of propagules on the site. So those four components are replenishment of propagules sufficient to replace species in case another disturbance occurs. Number two, attainment of reproductive maturity is adequate for replenishment of propagules. And the third one is senescence and loss of plants from the community. And the fourth one is loss of propagules and extinction of the species. Okay, so I'll try to give an example of a multi-pathway or a potential multi-pathway scenario of plant succession for aspen that is seral to western juniper. And this only applies to aspen that's seral to conifers. It wouldn't apply to aspen that exists without conifer in the stand. So in this seral aspen, we have an aspen woodland in the top left box, and we might have fire burning through that aspen, which cleans out all the juniper in there and restores a young aspen woodland stand that then might eventually have some juniper encroachment and then burn again and cycle between the upper left box and the lower left box, the aspen woodland and the young aspen woodland. If there is no fire in this aspen, seral aspen, we might go into something that looks more like an old aspen juniper woodland, and I would call it an old juniper aspen woodland, because the juniper would be the dominant species in there. And if that doesn't burn for decades or centuries or millennia, the aspen, we may lose the aspen out of that juniper aspen stand. And if that burns, we have the loss of propagule or extinction, like we saw on the last slide. And if we then have a fire, the stand will not go back to a young aspen woodland. It would go back to a mixed herb and shrubland that probably will then successionally move forward into another juniper stand. All right, so here we have a list of species in the plant community. We have western juniper, we have aspen, western snowberry, we have currant, bitterbrush, blue bunch wheatgrass, Idaho fescue, western needlegrass, balsam root, and lupin. And we have a series of different life history traits for these species. So which one, looking at their life history traits, would you think would persist to the very end of a sear or the successional stage if no disturbance occurs? So western juniper is a seed dispersed plant. It's tolerant. It can establish pretty much any time. Its sexual maturity is about 50 to 70 years. And same for replenishment of propagules. And it lives for a very long time. So life expectancy is, it says infinity here. Infinity is a really long time, but we have cord juniper that are upward of 1,000, and I think the oldest one is about 1,600 years. Aspen, persistent method is vegetative reproduction mostly. It can reproduce via seed as well, if the conditions are correct in the dry, semi-arid mountains. Establishment condition is intolerant. It really needs, at least if it's cereal to conifer, fire to establish. Replenishment of propagules is 0 because it's vegetative reproduction. Reproductive maturity is about 10 to 20 years old, and it doesn't live very long. It lives for about a little bit above 100 years. I think the older aspen that's been cored are about 200 years. And you can go through this list and look at these persistent methods and establishment conditions, age to reproductive maturity, and the longevity of them. And you can kind of get some kind of idea of who will persist in this sear to the very end, to the climax or the PNC. So doesn't look very good for aspen. It probably will be, it's intolerant, it doesn't live very long, probably will be outcompeted by species that live longer, for example, the juniper trees. Some others that may persist are the grasses, probably some blue bunch wheatgrass, probably some Idaho fescue, even though the shade of the aspen might cause some inconvenience for them. The needlegrass may also persist for a bit, and the other long-lived plants, depending on shade tolerance, would be another good property to have in here. But you can see how you really can look at a list like this, and just looking at the life history traits or critical events in these species lists, you can kind of get an idea of who is going to be the winners in the serial development, successional development. On the other hand, if we had more frequent fires, aspen might be one of the winners in this successional stage. So there we have it. There you can see how multi-pathway succession might work. And that concludes this lecture on models for succession.